I am honored now to introduce our guest speaker this evening. Unfortunately, Professor Simon May is suffering from flu, which prevented him from returning from Israel yesterday. However, he is with us on Zoom, and I am delighted that he is able to be with us virtually this evening. Professor May is visiting professor of philosophy at King's College, London. He is the author of 7 books on topics such as the philosophy of love and the ethics of Nietzsche, and his work has been translated into 10 languages. Most recently, he wrote How to Be a Refugee, One Family's Story of Exile and Belonging, the remarkable story of his German Jewish family before, during, and after the Third Reich. I had the honor of officiating at Professor May's mother's funeral, Marianne May, one of the subjects of this book and a renowned violinist. And we are immensely grateful to you, Professor May, for being with us here at the LJS this evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Alexandra. I hope everyone can hear me. And if you can't, please interrupt.
We can hear you clearly.
Excellent. I'm grateful and honored to have been asked to say a few words on this day when we remember loved ones and all those who perished in the Shoah. Most of us will never have met these loved ones, for they died long before we were born. But our love for them can be every bit as powerful as our love for the living. Indeed, I've always felt, and I know I'm not alone in thinking this, that love for our dead might be the purest of all forms of love, for it expects nothing in return. It demands nothing back. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard argued that it is also the freest love, because it's a love that is never, so to speak, extracted from us. As loved ones, however, the beloved and blessed dead are far from passive. They are often, like all those we most profoundly love, lodestars and guides and anchors of our life. They pose the deepest questions to us, questions that can structure our whole life. They help us set our ultimate goals. They enable us to become who we are and to fulfill our deepest potential. So remembering our ancestors who perished in the Shoah isn't, so to speak, just something we do for them, a vital tribute of reverence and awe for their destroyed lives. Nor is it just about remaining vigilant to an unsurpassed horror so that it never happens again. Remembrance, I think, is also about coming to grasp and to give thanks for what Hitler's victims, our loved ones, do for us. In my own life, my mother's father and uncle, Ernst and Theodor Liedtke, both of them killed by the Third Reich, have reciprocated and continue to reciprocate my love in exactly this way, as lodestars, as bequeathing values, life goals, and treasured ways of living, and as posing fundamental questions, above all about identity and belonging. Their challenges to me are a life's unfinished work. They constitute the heritage out of which my own trajectory has been forged. The words of Goethe's Faust, much of which they of course knew by heart, come to mind. Was du ererbt von deinen Vätern hast, erwirb es, es zu besitzen. What you've inherited from your ancestors, you must earn it in order to make it your own. If we imagine ourselves back into, say, 1932, the year before Hitler's ascent to power, my grandfather Ernst, my mother's father, seems to flourish in the capital of the German Reich beyond the imaginings of any of his own ancestors. He's a beneficiary of the long process of assimilation that many German Jews have undergone after the Prussian Edict of Emancipation of 1812. Vast progress has been made since 1743, when the great Enlightenment philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, trailblazing a path out of the ghetto and later known as the German Socrates, reputedly found that he could enter Berlin only through the gate reserved for cattle, swine, and Jews. However fragile and deluded this progress of emancipation might seem to us in retrospect, however much we might now see it as a house of cards waiting to collapse, to my grandfather, his world seemed blissfully safe on every account that I've had of it. Of course, the menace of anti-Semitism was nothing new. It had been there for as long as we could bear to recall it. Nonetheless, as his daughter, my mother, testified, it was a reality against which the solidity of his life insulated. Solidity was the word used by my family, the same word in German, Solidität, both my mother's and my father's, to describe assimilated Jewish life in Germany before Hitler. From the perspective of 1932, my grandfather had it all. A senior position in one of Berlin's leading law courts, the Kammergericht on the Herzlstraße, which still exists, indeed is Germany's oldest surviving court. 3 talented daughters, Ilse, Ursel, and Marianne, my mother, unusually for those days, all embarking on professions. A large apartment in prosperous Berlin West, the magic West pronounced W in German, Berlin W, spoken of with awe by my mother and her sisters, for it denoted a protective zone of high culture with its impregnable ethic of seriousness and learning and its veneration of music and philosophy, art and theatre. And though he and my grandmother light the Shabbat candles every Friday evening at his mother's house, there is otherwise no more Jewishness. That he sees as behind him, banished to the past, anachronistic, even inauthentic. He recognizes, indeed is deeply proud of the greatness of his Jewish heritage. But to him, it is the ladder that has prepared the Jews to climb to the heights of German and European culture, which can now be dispensed with. Jewish heritage is yesterday, it is preparatory. But the future is his beloved Germany, a nation of deep thinkers, dazzling musicians, epoch-making scientists, discipline, order, and integrity. Germany, for him and his kind, and there were many of them, the greatest culture in the contemporary West. It's like ancient Athens, but on the River Spree. Crucially, it's like ancient Athens, but without slaves and with opportunities for all. My grandparents' 12-room apartment in a street called Blumershof, a street which was bombed off the map in the war, there were musical evenings, poetry readings, and visits by illustrious musicians and writers. Jews and non-Jews mingled unself-consciously. In a memoir entitled A Berlin Childhood, the writer Walter Benjamin, whose own grandmother, Hedwig Schönflies, lived until her death in the apartment directly above my own grandparents', gives a sense of the spaciousness of the apartments in their building. And I quote, "The rooms in this apartment on the Blumershof were not only numerous, but in some cases very large. To reach my grandmother at her window, I had to cross the huge dining room and attain the furthest end of the living room. Only feast days, and above all Christmas Day," Benjamin writes, "could give an idea of the capaciousness of these rooms." End of quote. Yes, my grandparents, like Walter Benjamin's grandmother, like Freud's household in Vienna, and like countless other German Jews, celebrated Christmas, complete with a tree, the traditional cooked goose, biscuits of ginger, almond, and other seasonal fare laid out on brightly colored plates. and of course a table for each of their children laden with presents. This idyll of Blumershof, my grandparents' street, was potent. Its moral order seemed indestructible, an upholstered universe of impeccable structure. The rougher sides of Berlin, poverty, anarchy, bigotry, and later the brown shirts, were literally out of sight and out of mind. In words that almost exactly describe how my mother and her sisters referred to their childhood home, Walter Benjamin, in that same memoir that I just cited of his childhood, asks for his grandmother's apartment upstairs, and I quote, "What words can describe the almost immemorial feeling of bourgeois security that emanated from these rooms? Poverty, and even death itself, could have no place in them. Blumershof, that's their street, has become for me an Elysium." End of quote. And so it was that this tremendous sense of the solidity of a deeply assimilated life, epitomized by the apartment in which apparently death itself could have no place, so it was that this allowed my grandfather to make one further and immense step. He converted to Christianity just before the birth of his first child, my Aunt Hilda, thus formalizing and cementing his break from Jewish tradition. In this, he followed many German Jewish luminaries such as Karl Marx, Felix Mendelssohn, and Heinrich Heine in the 19th century, stretching all the way to people like Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg in the 20th. They had become Christians in the hope, as Heinrich Heine put it, of conversion being the, quote, entrance ticket to acceptance by German and European civilization. But then, on the 30th of January 1933, as we all know, Hitler came to power. Just a few weeks later, on the 17th of April 1933, which happened to be a Monday, Ernst, my grandfather, walked as usual from his home in Blumershof to the law court, arriving, as he always did, punctually at 8:30 a.m., but now to an unexpected greeting from his normally courteous clerk, a greeting which my mother would repeat in disbelieving horror until the day she died. "Hau hier sofort ab, du ostasiatischer Affe," which means "get out of here immediately, you East Asian monkey," the young clerk yelled, contemptuously using the familiar du that would otherwise have been an inconceivable way of addressing any colleague, let alone a superior. He then slammed the door to the offices in Ernst's face. The shock to my grandfather was, needless to say, devastating. But, to his great surprise, his dismissal turned out to be temporary. He was invited back to work a few weeks later, as the courts couldn't do without the nearly 50% of Berlin lawyers who were then Jews. He wasn't, however, reinstated in his former role. He was now confined to back office tasks out of public view and was no longer permitted to appear in court. Clearly, he was there only for as long as he could be of residual use, and until Hitler rejected once and for all any pleas for pragmatism. My grandfather may have been in his old court, but his colleagues and the authorities were palpably uninterested in his patriotism, his Protestantism, or his devoted professionalism, or indeed in the medal he'd won working for German intelligence in the First World War. He knew that the door had been slammed shut, not just to his legal offices, but to Germany itself, the culture of which gave meaning to everything he did in his life. This knowledge and the realization that he would soon be unable to provide for his family wore him progressively down. He was haunted by the horror that the Jewishness he thought he had assimilated out of existence had become a catastrophic liability and would imminently lead to his bankruptcy, now that he had to support a family on no earnings. The reality that his brilliant career, in which he had smoothly risen from humble provinciality in a community of just 500 Jews in a small West Prussian town, to a position of responsibility in the capital of the Weimar Republic, that all this had been shattered overnight and that he was now discardable, reusable, and again discardable, all this overwhelmed his modest but proud personality. Over the next few months, he became increasingly depressed, and on returning from his customary walk before lunch with my grandmother on the 17th of December 1933, he collapsed and died of a heart attack outside his own front door. Almost exactly 10 years later, in 1943, his brother Theodor met his own end in Auschwitz, after also refusing to emigrate. Like Ernst, he too could find a meaningful life only in Germany. His heroic housekeeper, Hedwig Kuss, a righteous Gentile if ever there was one, had done everything to persuade him to emigrate, while it was still possible to emigrate, and in 1941 had arranged for him to find refuge in Hungary, which was not yet occupied by the Nazis. But Theodor had turned back at the Hungarian border, and he had retraced his steps to Berlin. And when, to Hedwig's astonishment, he reappeared at her doorstep, she took him in, rented another apartment for them both, paid for it with the money she had earned from years in his service, and sheltered him for another year at vast risk to herself. Punishment for hiding Jews had by then become death, until the Gestapo finally came for him in 1942. Now, one of the things that has preoccupied me since I was a teenager is the difference between integration and assimilation. It's a question that I think has assumed much larger dimensions today in a world of migrants and migrant identities, where some 85 million people worldwide are forcibly displaced, of which 26 million are refugees, a number that might soon swell to well over 30 million as a result of the catastrophe in Ukraine. To me, integration and assimilation refer to very distinct phenomena. Integration is about social adaptation, learning to speak, dress, behave in the manner of the host country, whereas assimilation is internal, an adaptation of the heart, an alchemy of the soul, in which it systematically attempts to shed its original identity and the cultural memory that goes with it. I grew up in a family that on my mother's, though much less so on my father's side, had both integrated and assimilated to their original German habitat so intensely that they were in many ways lost when my mother and father fled to the UK after Hitler's rise to power. For even the horrific extremes to which the Nazis had taken German nationalism did not diminish their own love of German culture, nor their insistence on speaking the language. Like their parents, they were Germans first and Jews second. Of course, the Germany from which they'd escaped had told them that they weren't Germans at all anymore. Indeed, cancelled their citizenship in 1938. Meanwhile, the British authorities were recognizing them in precisely the opposite way, as very much still German, and therefore as so-called enemy aliens, forbidden to take paid employment and denied UK citizenship. As a result, both my parents remained stateless for a decade between 1938 and 1947, and for much of the war they were under nighttime curfew. A curfew that, by the way, my mother once unthinkingly broke, as a result of which she was arrested and incarcerated in a police cell for the night, before being tried by a magistrate. What a blessing this turned out to be. That night locked up in a cell saved her life, because when she returned to her boarding house in Belsize Park, and being released, she found that it was now a pile of rubble. It had suffered a direct hit by a German bomb. Thanks to her arrest, of course, I'm here today. Anyway, going back to 1933, what happened to my grandmother and their 3 daughters after my grandfather's death in December of that year? Did Hitler cause them to return to their Jewish roots, as one might expect, to seek refuge in the true solidity of those abandoned roots? The answer is no. Not even Hitler caused them to return, anyway not until old age. My grandmother remained in Berlin for all of the war and miraculously came to no harm. Far from seeking a way back to their ancestral religion, her three daughters, my mother and her two older sisters, converted to Catholicism during the 1930s after Hitler's rise to power. Aside from that, they ended up having drastically different trajectories. One of my mother's sisters, who was called Ursula, like the current president of the European Commission, who was then a young actress in Berlin, was expelled from her first job in 1935 after the initial raft of race laws had been enacted by the Nazi regime, and then spent years in hiding. Until, in 1941, she achieved the almost unheard of feat of wangling official acceptance as an Aryan. Extraordinarily, she achieved it with the help of one of the most powerful deputies of Goebbels, a man called Hans Hinkel. Even more extraordinarily, Hinkel, an SS officer and state secretary in the so-called Ministry of Propaganda and the People's Enlightenment, happened to be the very person whom Goebbels had placed in charge of purging German cultural life of Jews, including budding actors like my Aunt Ursel. Ever since Ursel first told me her Aryanization story when I was a teenager, I'd known that a young fellow acting student of hers had back then recently married the heir to IG Farben, a huge chemical company, indeed the world's largest chemical company then, that had not only bankrolled the Nazi Party, but would go on to run the slave labor camp at Auschwitz, among other atrocities. But it was only when in 2008 I found a letter in the German Federal Archives in Berlin, written by my aunt in her own hand to State Secretary Hinkel, that I discovered she had been personally received by him in his Berlin office. This letter concludes with the moving words of, quote, endless gratitude to you, in other words to Hinkel, for giving me back my life, unquote. Me, it is still astonishing that a young actress with almost no experience, whose most recent work had been in cabaret venues subsequently closed down by Goebbels, who had been expelled from her profession 5 long years beforehand and had somehow survived in ethnic purgatory ever since. It remains astonishing that she found herself in 1941, the year before the Holocaust begins, invited for an intimate chat with one of Goebbels' right-hand men. It also astonishes me that she tried. Needless to say, any attempt to be deemed an Aryan was hugely risky. The very application drew attention to you. Why would you apply if you had nothing to hide? But just as seriously, by the early 1940s, if you were found to have lied about your ethnic heritage, the punishment for all parties to the lie, including the non-Jews who aided and abetted it, was death. In any event, after her successful Aryanization, Ursel went on to marry into the German aristocracy in September 1943 and returned to her theatre and to an almost normal life, or as normal as it could be during a world war that Germany was already losing. But her fake identity wasn't secure. In October 1943, just 4 weeks after she married and became a countess, Power was blown and the Gestapo came after her. Again, the documents exist in the German archives showing the date and time at which the Gestapo called for her. He then fled to Holland and with the help of the Dutch underground hid for the rest of the war. My mother, the youngest of 3 sisters, was the only one to leave Germany. She fled to London in 1934, where she ensconced herself in the dense, intense world of Central European Jewish émigrés, a remarkable world, of course, that numbered so many brilliant artists and scientists, architects, lawyers, writers, and entrepreneurs, among many others. But of course, as an enemy alien, she was forbidden to work and was always on the verge of hunger and homelessness. until in 1939 she had her lucky break. The Czech government had recently exiled itself to London after Hitler invaded the Sudetenland, and Jan Masaryk, its longtime ambassador to the UK and later to be Czech foreign minister, and in 1948 mysteriously defenestrated by the Soviets. Thrown out of a window, in other words, to his death. Jan Masaryk invited her to join a piano, violin, and cello trio, the so-called Czech trio, that had lost its original violinist in the move from Prague. This despite the fact that my mother, of course, wasn't Czech. This gave her her first legitimate income and really established her professionally as a violinist. She also met and played numerous concerts at that time with Benjamin Britten, as well as other British composers, and through them became a champion of contemporary British music. Yet the core of her cultural world, her real belonging, remained the Central European Jewish friends and colleagues who filled our home, and whose homes in North London we would invariably visit at weekends. While the core of her religious work, of her religious world, remained back at that time Catholic. And then, many decades later, something extraordinary happened as old age crept up on her. Despite the distance at which, in one sense, she had long held her Jewish identity, she had, of course, married a Jew. Indeed, she had always said that she would only marry a Jew. She had ensured that my brother and I had had a bris, and her circle, as I've said, remained almost exclusively Jewish because it was with them that she felt at home and at ease. In other words, while stubbornly purging her inner world of cultural memory and belonging, she also lived almost entirely with and among Jews. This can be very difficult for people to understand, I found, not surprisingly. Then, one day in 2009, out of the blue, she had a heart attack, from which her doctors said she would not recover. Your mother has 72 hours to live, one doctor said to me, in that pitilessly matter-of-fact voice sometimes assumed by medics when delivering terrible news. Everything is going wrong, he said, and her body is shutting down, the well-known euphemism for dying. There is nothing to be done. She's far too old for surgery, and medication would be useless. Well, that prediction turned out to be wrong. Over the next few weeks, she recovered almost to full strength, without surgery or medication. When she was well enough again, she announced that she wanted, finally, after all those decades in exile, to move back to Berlin, the city she had never stopped loving. The pain of exile had never left her, she said. Each time we visited Germany in my childhood and youth, and also German Switzerland, she would utter the same phrase when we left. It seems, she said, so unnatural to be leaving once again, and yet in view of the terrible history, also so right. But now, in 2009, Germany had moved on. It had apologized repeatedly, it had paid her generous reparations, and it had returned to her and her sisters' families a magnificent building in East Berlin's Prenzlauer Berg district that the Nazis had confiscated from her parents in 1938 under the law on the so-called Aryanization of Jewish property. And so plans to move back to the city of her birth were made, and at her request, I visited senior homes in leafy Berlin neighborhoods to try to find one that she might like. Meanwhile, her near-death experience prompted me to ask her a crucial question that had been an unspoken taboo for decades. What were her funeral instructions when the time came? Did she want to be buried as a converted Catholic, or in a Jewish cemetery, or in a secular graveyard? This brought everything back to what I thought was the insoluble problem of identity. Her reply amazed me. Quote, it was, quote, in the Jewish cemetery where your father is, where they all are, he said, as if nothing could be more self-evident. Are you sure? I asked. You converted to Catholicism so long ago. Are you sure you don't want a Catholic burial? And what about last rites? No, she said, I want to be in that Jewish cemetery. By that Jewish cemetery, she meant the LJS's Pound Lane, where my father is buried. As I said, I was stunned by her reply. Despite the sage words of the great Kabbalah scholar Gershom Scholem, he profoundly doubted whether all those attempts at assimilation among his fellow German Jews could ever be successful. Jews whom he called, quote, Jews in flight from themselves, unquote. For Scholem had insisted, and I quote again, that the substance of Judaism still reveals itself with absolute clarity, even in the Jew who has reached the nadir of complete assimilation, unquote. No matter, he went on, how extreme their attempts at assimilation, at self-deception about who they are, at erasing their inherited identity and changing their name, no matter how smoothly Shmuel Dembitzer becomes Siegfried Deutsch, nonetheless, he said, and I quote again, a component of Jewish feeling, a certain piety binds all Jews to the past. Or as that self-proclaimed Jewish infidel, Sigismund Shlomo Freud, better known under his changed name Sigmund Freud, once said in a letter to his disciple Karl Abraham, the Talmudic way of thinking cannot disappear in us just like that. In any event, and I'm coming to a conclusion, I asked my mother the same question about burial many times over the following years, and I always got the same answer. I found it hard nonetheless that her reply never had a redemptive quality. It never conveyed the sense that a semi-repudiated heritage had finally been embraced, and that the source of banishment from the world was now a harbinger of solace. Just as with her sisters at the end of their own lives, there was no explicit closure, such as that attributed to the famous German Jewish woman of letters, Rahel van Harden, a contemporary of Goethe and much admired by him and other luminaries of German culture, who, according to her husband, proclaimed on her deathbed in 1833, the thing which was the misery and misfortune of my life, having been born a Jewess, this I should on no account now wish to have missed, unquote. My mother didn't utter such explicit words of reconciliation. She just changed her mind and announced her decision as if the previous decades of tortured denial simply hadn't happened. But I selfishly did feel a profound sense of redemptive closure when we buried her where she'd wanted to be, in that Jewish cemetery where they all are. I'm sorry. And I was and remain greatly honored that her funeral was officiated by Rabbi Alex Wright. As I walked down the gravel paths between the graves, I could see why this was where she'd chosen. I recognized names I hadn't seen or heard since my youth. Names like Esther Salomon, who'd been in and out of our house since we were children, or the Freyhans, music lovers from Berlin. These were her people. Like her closest childhood friends, Marianne Nussbaum, Marianne Imberg, Mother's circle, whether intimate or professional, had always been, as I said, almost exclusively Jewish. That was her world. And she rests in the LJS's cemetery, a stone's throw from my father, my uncle, my half-brother, and so many of her colleagues, friends, and rivals who filled her life. The move back to Germany, the return to her hometown of Berlin, was not to be. This, her burial in that cemetery where they all are, was the return she actually made. Now, really finally, as I repeatedly emphasize in the family memoir to which Rabbi Alexandra referred, to recount these extraordinary contortions of ethnic and cultural concealment, absolutely not to criticize them. Who are those of us who have never experienced racial hatred in its vehement forms to criticize anyone's strategy to survive in such conditions? Nonetheless, my grandfather in particular has posed questions for me by which I've been besieged all my life. Did he die so quickly, and was the shock so calamitous because he had severed himself from his moorings in the ancient faith of his ancestors? Had this closing down of a whole area of innate sensibility and cultural memory fatally weakened him? Wasn't his repudiation of thousands of years of belonging also a suicide note, part of a dying that had already been going on for many years and was not yet complete? And didn't all that fighting against himself make him fatally vulnerable when the Nazi disaster struck? My answer to all these painful questions is inevitably yes. Of course, we cannot live out everything we are. We cannot possibly live out all the identities of which we might be comprised. Some parts of our mosaic of identity speak to us with such familiarity and intensity that all our other roots seem insipid by comparison. I know people with one Jewish grandparent, and there are some like Ruth in the Bible with none, who claim this heritage as their chief identity and become pious Jews and feel they have finally found a home to which they're unequivocally called out of deep inner belief. And I know others with the same heritage who this day are indifferent to it and even repudiate it. My grandfather Ernst confronts me with these issues and questions in the starkest possible terms. Theodor, his brother, who also couldn't imagine an existence that wasn't German, echoes those questions more faintly, but equally poignantly. Neither has a grave to which I can return. There are no plots of earth that have permitted them to rest. Ernst's grave in Berlin was almost certainly destroyed by the Nazis. His brother Theodor has a grave in the air, in the words of the great German-speaking Jewish poet Paul Shalom. The legal clerk who precipitated my grandfather's death and the concentration camp official who turned on the gas that killed my great-uncle, Shalom writes, played snakes and dreamt of death as a master from Germany. These near ancestors, just two of the people who perished as a result of the terrible events leading up to the Shoah, these two people have posed the conundrum of identity, belonging, and cultural memory that have faced me all my life, and that I think also face our times with unsurpassed force. It's they who have most decisively cemented my Jewish identity and given me the fullest reality to my Jewish heritage, precisely in their denial of it. I cannot leave these beloved ancestors behind or let go, but nor can I just remember them with candles once a year. Our duty towards the victims of the Shoah is not just to memorialize them, not just to commemorate their lives and the ungraspable injustice of their deaths. It is not even just to say nie wieder, never again, though these words seem horribly pertinent to developments in our European home today. For me, remembrance means attending to very personal questions these beloved ancestors force us to face, questions that are different and intensely private for each of us. It means giving thanks for the life, the being, the values, the goals, and the secrets they have directly passed to us, their descendants. And it means gratitude for the redemption to which their suffering has opened the door, that today we may more freely choose where we belong, who we are, and who we are to be. As I suggested in opening, the dead whom we deeply loved are not passive. I know for my part that even when I think I've done my best to open myself to their challenges and their gifts, I'm still fumbling. Thank you.
Professor May, thank you so much for really an extraordinary lecture, talk. You began talking about the purest form of love. You ended talking about love, and you've taken us on a journey, a very personal journey about your own family, your own ancestors, and woven that story against the backdrop of the history that we all know so well. The end of your talk reminds me of the verse in Song of Songs, which we read just a few days ago at Pesach, love is strong as death.